Hi, I'm Brent. Welcome to my language journal. I have a lot to talk about today, but first I would like to just say thank you to everybody who's been watching. The channel is somehow extended beyond Refold at this point, and some people are joining the Chinese server via this channel, which I think is awesome. We're on track to have about 500 views per personal update at this point, which is great. Thank you all for tuning in. You may all remember last video, about 2 months ago or so, I was a bit demotivated. I was at a point where I noticed a significant discrepancy between my ability to interpret input and generate output. I called this the input-output discrepancy. And again, like I said, I was demotivated. And you guys were seriously great. Like, I received probably 30 messages across YouTube, Discord, and that, people giving me their thoughts and opinions, and it gave me a lot to consider, and I think it's what allowed me to reach the current point that I'm at. And it's obviously a better point. So thank you all for caring enough to write up some of the long messages you sent me. But one of the key things that I noticed is that perhaps I was overestimating my ability to listen to Chinese, to interpret it. And it's clearly the case in my mind now that reading and listening are, despite being correlated in terms of ability, naturally, they're actually quite different. And it's been my experience that they activate very different areas of my brain. That's what I've noticed through reflection. And so I was a bit curious. It's like, are there actually any scientific data that back up this assertion, this idea that listening and reading really are fundamental skills that activate very different parts of the brain? And I did a little Google Scholar search, and granted, I haven't done a literature review or anything, but this is one study I found here, and I'll read a little bit for you. So basically, there are shared areas, as you might expect, but reading comprehension was also associated with more left lateralized activation, and I'll explain what all these terms mean after, because I have a bit of a background in this. Left lateralized activation and with left inferior occipital cortex activation. And then listening comprehension, on the other hand, was associated with extensive bilateral, so both sides on the temporal cortex, so down here, and more activation of the whole cortex. And what does this really mean? So there's a couple different areas of the brain that I can mention. There's the occipital lobe, which is at the back here. It's where your primary visual cortex is. You can process visual information there. There's obviously a lot more to it than that. And then temporal it's like down here. Left side of your brain is typically associated more with language, which is why you see language association here, or in the left side rather. But interestingly, the listening comprehension was more associated with all parts of the brain. And there are a couple truths in neuroscience that are probably worth talking about. The deeper you go in the brain, the more fundamental and historically present these areas were. So for example, this is all cortex, so like the outside part of your brain. Then there's the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. If you go back to the hindbrain, for example, you have things like the reticular activating system, which it does a bunch of things. Like for example, along with the pons, it controls your abilities, your body's ability to lock you down as you sleep, so you don't sleepwalk. We share that system with a lot of different animals, because obviously we sort of diverged over time, but the further you go up to the cortex, the more differences you see. And interestingly enough, the reason that humans can produce language is because our cortexes are so fundamentally different. But it's also interesting that listening comprehension activates more of the brain, which indicates that it's perhaps less specialized and more fundamental, which goes back to my previous assertion that in older videos, that is, that listening and speaking are more fundamental, and that reading is an artifact of culture. So I thought that was interesting, and it kind of gets at the point that I was mentioning, that listening and reading are very much different systems. Correlated, granted, but very different. So I was at a point where my reading was strong. Listening was not as strong as I thought. I fell victim to what I'm going to call the comprehension distortion error, which is basically, and I think I mentioned this before, the whole idea of the VCR analogy. So if you look back on videos that you watched as a kid, like, or movies rather, and then you probably remember them relatively fondly. Like I have a distinct memory of watching a Scooby-Doo movie where they go to Scotland, and they're trying to chase down the Loch Ness Monster. So I remember a month or two ago, I looked up the trailer of that on YouTube. I was on a bit of a nostalgia trip, and the movie looks atrocious. Yet, in my recollection of it, it was a beautiful movie with great animations, and it's just not the case. And language is like that as well. It isn't until you progress further along and see what is possible that you can actually look back in retrospect and see where your weaknesses were. So I was falling victim to this comprehension distortion error despite being aware of it, which is interesting. So it's like, even though you're aware of your biases, they still govern your decision making. Maybe less so than people who aren't aware of them, but I find that interesting. So I came to the conclusion that I clearly needed to build a stronger mental model of the language, meaning I just needed to spend more time immersing in Chinese with just listening. So what I did is I basically cut out anything that wasn't listening. So I would listen to dramas, I would listen to podcasts, and that was basically the extent of my immersion. And what I found helpful, particularly at the beginning, when my listening comprehension was clearly not as good as I thought, what I did is I would use language learning with Netflix, or I think Language Reactor, it's called now, which has the ability for you to press a single key to hide and unhide the subtitles. So I would first listen without the subtitle on a certain line, and if I got it, I would just move on. If I didn't, and it seems like I probably should have got it, I would open it up, read it, and then re-listen a couple of times and see if I could train myself to hear those specific parts. So I did a lot of that, but honestly, over the past 2 months, I had a prerequisite course that I needed to complete for my master's, like business fundamentals and stuff, because my undergrad wasn't in business. And an extension of that, I've developed a bit of a passion for things like finance and investing. I find that stuff really interesting. So I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, productively learning about it, but granted, it's not time spent on Chinese. So the time that I have spent recently on Chinese is lower than I would like it to be. Maybe a lot of variance to it. Some days 10, 11 hours, some days 4 hours, etc. But one thing that I've noticed is I've had a massive improvement in my ability to listen and interpret Chinese. And I'm not going to try and fall victim to the cognitive or the comprehension distortion error again. I'm perfectly aware that my listening is probably still very weak relative to what a native speaker would be. But, for example, I often do language exchanges with friends, Chinese friends, and sometimes we're in English, sometimes we're in Chinese, but often what ends up happening is if we engage in a deeper discussion, we sort of default into me speaking English and them speaking Chinese. Like, for example, we were talking about Chinese universities, and we were talking about the difficulties that Chinese youth currently are facing in the country, and the whole idea of the Tangping, which is like the lying flat movement. And we were talking about this, and it's not exactly a simplistic topic, you can imagine. so we went back and forth, and I could effectively engage in a rather deep conversation, speaking English and listening to them speak Chinese. Yet if I were to speak Chinese, I would not be able to communicate what I wanted to say. So this has led me to this idea that I think I'm currently on the precipice of something of a breakthrough into a higher level of output. Like my listening is now at a fundamental base level that's sufficient for me then to activate a bunch of latent knowledge that I have about the language and start outputting. So that's my theory, but a bit more on that perhaps is I don't really know how to describe my current level to you guys. The more experience I get in language learning, the more I realize that, and not really, I think I've said this before, but not at their own fault per se, but the refold comprehension system is lacking, and they've had to perhaps necessarily simplify it so that the beginners could have a rough model to evaluate themselves on. But baked into the model in my mind is this implicit assumption that acquisition is binary. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Excuse me. It's like, let's say you're level 5 or whatever, or level 4, which is maybe like 50% comprehension. I may be remembering the specific points incorrectly, but let's say 50% comprehension. That implies that the 50% that you do understand is understood at a 1 level, a binary level, like you understand it. It's not that you understand a portion of that 50%. It's not that there's a gradient to it. In my experience, it's actually been precisely that. It's that you have a gradient understanding of a character, and then you have a gradient understanding of how that character is used in certain words, and then you have a gradient understanding of how that character is used in a sentence, but perhaps how that word is also used in a sentence. And it's not that you ever understand 50%. It's like maybe 10% of it you understand at a 90% level, 20% you understand at an 80% level, etc. And you can see how this would make for a pretty garbage model when you're trying to teach people how to learn languages. But that's why I struggle so much with explaining my comprehension, because it's like, how do you describe that? How do you even measure that without it being unbelievably subjective? And the answer is you can't. This entire area is just all based upon anecdotes and case studies and that, and it's why it can't really be studied particularly well. But anyway, so I have this unique thesis, this idea that I'm on the precipice of a breakout. And you guys might remember that last time I made a promise to you. I said that I'm going to output in this video. And I still intend to output, not in this video, but I'm going to do one better. What I'm planning on doing is I'm going to upload a separate video, and I'm going to test this precipice theory. This idea that I'm right at a point where I think I'm about to break out. So here's what's going to happen. In maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I'll upload another video. And this video will have me at 2 different points. So probably tomorrow I'll do this. And then 2 weeks from now, I'll do this. I'll have 4 questions. The first question will be just basically introduce yourself. And the 4th question will be something very complex. So maybe, how do you think culture shapes a person's sense of self, for example? And the difficulty of the questions will scale up. And then what you guys will get is time, like a snapshot of me answering these questions tomorrow. And then after the output gauntlet, as I'm calling it. And what is the output gauntlet? It's basically, I'm at a point where I feel like I need a large amount of output to flip a switch in myself. Like, can I convince my brain that it's time to activate all that latent knowledge that I built up over probably I think I'm about 2,700 hours since April, which is a lot. Like that's a lot. Like I have a lot of knowledge on this language. There's no doubt about it. So I'm going to try and chorus / shadow 1 hour a day. And I'm going to try and speak to people in a conversation, whether that be through italki or through language exchange partners, about, I want to say 2 hours per day, but it might not always be that much. Some days it might be more, but like a mean value of 2 hours would be ideal. And then the idea is, after doing this for a week or two, I will flip a switch in myself. My brain will recognize that this is necessary. And then you guys will see a significant difference, particularly at the upper-ended questions, the more difficult questions, in my ability to respond, both in terms of accent, because of all the chorusing I'm going to be doing, the complexity of the grammar and the vocabulary, etc. And this is perhaps going to be more interesting for the people who speak Chinese, but I think all of you will get something from it. But so I mentioned this idea of, can I convince my brain that it's time to flip a switch and activate all my latent knowledge? And this kind of brings me into my next point of identity, which I've talked about before. And I really have talked about this many times, but I think I have some new unique ideas that I've sort of derived from reflection and introspection regarding this topic. So the first idea is that my internal dialogue seems to be related to my subjective sense of identification with the Chinese culture and the Chinese people at a specific point in time. And that's abstract, so let me try and make it a bit more concrete. Like, this makes me to believe that one's internal dialogue and thoughts are just simply a reflection of that which they identify with and are automatically like compelled and attracted towards. It's like you identify with the Chinese culture and people, or whatever culture you're learning about through your target language. And then the degree to which you identify with that is the degree to which you're going to be attracted or compelled to learn about this language and this culture. It's like if one sees themselves as needing to be part of a group, so the Chinese group in my case, their brain will begin to do something of like an accommodation sequence, an assimilation sequence. This is what I described before as the zone of perceived necessity, I think I called it. It's like this idea that you reach a point where this culture becomes so fundamental in your life and your view of yourself that your body and your brain has no choice but to integrate it into almost fragment a portion of your personality to become part of this culture. And now, the culture may not accept you, and it probably won't be the case in Chinese for me, because obviously there's a physical element to this. I'm not even saying that I necessarily want to be Chinese. It's not the point. And if that's what you're getting from this, it's not really what I'm going for. It's more just this idea of perceived necessity, because your brain has this schema of itself as being part of one culture. But were you to have been born in another country, that schema could have easily been changed. So there's some flexibility to it. But you also have attachment to your own culture. And I think there's an interesting anecdote of what this actually feels like. So I was at my grandmother's birthday, probably like probably a month ago at this point, actually. Time passes quickly. And my grandmother was there, my father was there, my grandmother's siblings were there with some of their family. And this is a very Canadian group of people. And I was sitting there, I was talking to them in English, obviously. And I kind of realized something. I paused there for a second, and I realized that I was interacting with these people in a culturally acceptable manner, generating English sentences effortlessly. And it felt weird. And I don't know if you guys can necessarily get what I'm going for, but it's like this meta awareness that I am a member of this culture. And it isn't until you engage with another culture and realize that there are in fact differences that you recognize just how a person's identity could fragment. Like I felt like I brought a part of my Chinese identity, or maybe it's that I was engaging using my English identity, but in that moment, some portion of my Chinese identity came out and looked in on this situation as like a third party. And it was quite an odd experience, because it was one of the first times in months I had, or one of the only times in months that I had used a fork, for example, instead of chopsticks. So it's an anecdote, but I think it maybe captures this whole idea of identity well. Just going to take some water. And in fact, I think this is why moving to a country where your target language is spoken works so well. Like, sure, you're exposed to the language more, which obviously helps, more immersion, but it's also this case that when you move to this country, whatever country, you are then in a point where your brain begins to perceive some sort of social necessity to learning this language, and thus your internal dialogue, which I mentioned before, as being some sort of indication of your identity and your thoughts, and your things like your cultural value structure. All these things begin to change through the previously mentioned accommodation or assimilation sequence. All of this comes in because your attachment to your previous culture and your previous identity is sort of severed. Like, you don't have connection to it. You don't have things pulling you back. And I think that's why moving to a country works so well. And obviously, if you're an expat and you just move around in expat circles, you don't have this because your culture is there pulling you back in. That's your problem if you go to another country and don't engage with the culture. And really what this is, it's a sequence in your brain that has evolved to facilitate social success. Because obviously, previously you have things like Dunbar's number, which is basically this idea that people used to live in small groups of 150 to like 250 people, and everybody would know one another. And social success within that group was obviously critical to your survival. Like, if you were ousted, you were probably going to die. So your brain has a bunch of mechanisms for allowing it to fit into groups. And that sort of moving to another country co-ops those mechanisms. But the case most of us are in is that we can't really go, especially early on, especially due to the pandemic, to the country where our target language is spoken. And one second, you scroll down here. If cultural identification is necessary, and I'm positing that it is, to prompt your brain into assimilating the language into your being, or sort of fragmenting part of yourself, and you are unable to fully immerse yourself into the target culture in that country, which is entirely fine, and it's necessary for most people, you are likely to have points where your motivation wane. And I've had this. I'm sure all of you have. And if you haven't, you're probably just not being honest with yourself. Or you haven't been studying for long enough. What I've learned is that in a situation where you are not in your target language's country, you need some sort of external accountability system to remind yourself to limit exposure to those limit exposure to the cultural pull of the country that you're currently in. And obviously to a healthy degree, like people have different goals. But if you're trying to reach a high level, particularly in something like Chinese or Japanese, something meaningfully dissimilar from, I'm going to assume that you speak a European language, so English, I think there's a lot of Germans in Refold, etc. You are at some point going to need to meaningfully, or not meaningfully, you are at some point going to have to distance yourself from your culture. Like, it doesn't necessarily need to be at the beginning. You can build up some foundation, but I do think it is necessary at some point that you basically go full immersion to learn the language. And that might not be a popular opinion. And I don't think if you're trying to sell people a vision of learning a language, you necessarily want to make it sound as difficult as it likely is. But yeah, I do think that's necessary. So the question then is, what do I mean by an external accountability system? Let me pull up Microsoft Paint here. I'll draw something for you guys. Okay. Let me just make sure you guys can see this. See myself there. All right, so draw. Nice. So let's imagine two sides here. So this side is in country, in TL country, we'll say. Country. And this side is in non-TL country. And then let's say that this, how do I draw here? Oh, there we go. Let's get the paintbrush. Thicken it a bit. Okay, nice. All right, so let's imagine that this is the target culture. And this is you. If you are in the TL country, you may have this red group here. This is the expat community. But really the pull of the expat community here is going to be minimal. Like, this is the influence that you have pulling you away from your goal of engaging with the culture. If you are in a non-TL culture, so this is you again, you're a bit bigger this time. And this is the TL culture. You then have everything on all of these sides trying to pull you away. There are more things trying to disengage you from your target language culture, obviously because you're not in that culture. So accountability systems basically put up walls here such that when this arrow starts to pull away, it bounces off the wall and it keeps you on track, gradually moving towards this culture. That's how I'd conceptualize it. Now, a bit more concrete. Just make sure I transitioned you over. Good stuff. What do I mean by accountability systems? Well, I have two in my life. So, sort of three, but mainly two. Like, the third sort of one would be this YouTube channel, where obviously if I just stopped learning Chinese, I would let down now hundreds of people at this point who are at least moderately interested in my progress. But the big two, and the ones I use on a daily basis, are my tracking sheet, which you guys have seen, and then my accountability partner. And let's open up my tracking sheet here. So this is the sheet, and it's not the updated one. And interestingly, in probably 10 days or so, my accountability and partner and myself, I'll call him T, will be releasing a new version of this for the Refold community, and I guess anybody who stumbles upon my video. And it's a sheet that has an entirely automated system for tracking all of your data across weekly, yearly timeframes, all of these different timeframes. And all you need to do, there'll be a simple version, a complex version, has a ton of customizability. Like, what you're seeing here isn't necessarily a representation of that sheet, although the framework is still the same. Basically, all you need to do is press a single button at the end of the day right here, and it pastes all of your data. So all that you need to do is set these, which I'll cover in that video whenever we release it, or don't download the simple sheet, and all of this is removed. And all that you need to do is pick your task, and then input the start time, end time, and press this, and then all of your data will be summarized, and you can see it all in charts and stuff, and it's cool. But the tracking sheet, basically, how I would describe it, and switching back over, is it's an accurate record of what you've done, which removes the sort of bias you would have looking back at things in retrospect. Because our memory is a lot worse than we would like to believe. And we're actually not good at remembering things from the past accurately. So you can record all of your data here, you can set goals and all of that, and that's fantastic. You have your primary motivation of moving towards the target culture, but if you're in a country where this isn't spoken, there's going to be distractions. You obviously have your job, or you're in school or something, and I'll focus on those. Find a healthy balance, but you need something that's going to allow you to bounce if you deviate too far from your goal, from the culture, right? And the tracking sheet is that. But here's the question. What happens if you just say, screw the sheet, basically? I'm not doing this. You don't feel a connection to the target culture, or a sufficient enough connection. You forget about the sheet, which is really just you distancing yourself and probably trying to hide from the local failures you've had. Really, what I noticed in having this experience of hiding from my failures, like having a week where I just didn't really input that much data, didn't move it to the summary sheet, which is now all automated, is that was allowing me to hide, to not confront the fact that I wasn't doing what I ought to do. So I implemented this secondary system. And this system is external. It's socially enforced accountability, basically. I have an accountability partner. At the end of every single day, we will send, with the exception of like if we're out or something, or it's a Friday and we're out socializing, maybe we won't send it. But the vast majority of the time, like 95% of the time at the end of the day, we'll send our sheet. And this essentially forces us to input data every single day, because we know we're going to have to take a screenshot of that sheet and send it to the other person, and that other person is going to say something to us about how we did that day. And having these two systems allows you to basically lock yourself into a commitment to track your data, which puts up those walls that I showed in my lovely diagram to push you towards that culture. But the thing is, what you need to be careful of, in cases where you do not have any meaningful cultural identification and your focus is entirely based on external accountability systems, so it's like you don't actually really like the culture that much that you're learning about, in which case you should probably question why you're actually learning that language. I'm going to call what you've created here. So you've put up strict walls, but the arrow towards the culture isn't that strong, so you're just bouncing back and forth, really. I'm going to call this an authoritarian system that you built. And here's the thing with an authoritarian system. While an authoritarian system may work temporarily, if your accountability system is strong enough, you have a good enough partner, etc., and you need to send it every day, there's eventually going to come a point where you resent the language. And interestingly enough, you won't resent the system, because people in authoritarian systems, or some sort of authoritarian governing influence, not necessarily a government, but something that governs their actions. You can see it with Stockholm Syndrome, a bunch of other things I'm about to mention in anecdote. People tend not to dislike the system, they tend to begin to dislike the thing that they're being forced to do. And you don't want to develop that sort of relationship with the language you want to learn. So here's the anecdote. I was talking to a language partner, just a friend at this point, who graduated from a very good university in China. like a C9 for. Maybe I can explain that because a lot of you guys won't know. A C9 is basically the Ivy League in China, and it's on average, I think, 3 times more competitive than the top 5 Ivy League schools in America, for some perspective in terms of acceptance rate. So very competitive. And she mentioned that the people there are typically not very happy. They don't really enjoy what they're doing. They are there as a result of parents in a school system that ground away their youth, studying all day, every day to get to this point. They don't like the process of learning. It's just what they ought to do. And to some degree, this is a necessity in a third world country. Like China's rich in some ways, but poor in others. So for some people, it's necessary to grind this way. But having that outside authoritarian influence makes these people develop a very negative relationship with learning itself. And one thing I've noticed is, perhaps this is my privilege speaking, but in Canada, I didn't have those authoritarian influences, whether that be through my parents or the school system. And so I developed a rather healthy, in my mind, relationship with learning. And I quite enjoy learning, actually. I'm just going to unbutton this. Getting a bit hot. I want to look nice for you guys, but a cardigan in the house makes me a bit sweaty sometimes. But I think I've developed a rather healthy relationship with learning. And it's because I didn't have this authoritarian influence. So I guess the cautionary tale here would be that while external systems help, really what needs to happen is these external systems need to come secondary to some genuine attraction to the language and culture. Otherwise, you're sort of dooming yourself to sour your relationship with the language, and then what's likely to happen is you're eventually just going to quit. And you probably don't want that, unless you do, in which case, more power to you. Don't fall victim to the sunk cost fallacy. If you really don't like the language you're learning, then maybe it's time to move on. But one final observation that I'm going to end this video with is I've noticed something. A lot of people come to the Chinese Discord and they'll introduce themselves, and some people are very passionate about learning the language at the beginning, and they're going to reach all these different goals. And then a lot of them I quite frankly never see again. And I've noticed some things between the people who stick around and succeed and the people who are very passionate about some broad abstract goal at the beginning and then just likely quit. It's that the people who succeed have this genuine passion for some aspect of the culture that they're learning, Chinese culture in this case, or whether that be mainland or Taiwan. We have all sorts of different people who are interested in different things. But the people who leave typically have some sort of superficial reason for learning. It's like they saw the xiaomas of the world on YouTube, and nothing wrong with his clickbait if that's how he's doing it. But it creates this illusion for people where it's like, oh, that would be really cool to do. Look at all the social validation he gets by going out and doing that. And so they come and they say, oh, I'm going to study 8 hours a day, and then in 2 years I'm going to be fluent in Chinese. Like, it doesn't actually work like that. But even if it did, if that's your motivation to get social validation and go out on the streets of New York or wherever you are and get Chinese people to go, what's that? I need a zhongwen, etc. It's not sustainable. And I guess what I would leave this video at is, you guys should probably ask yourself, because this is something I've had to confront recently as well. Why are you truly learning the language that you are? And this is important to ask because your long-term success in this language is likely contingent on how strong of a reason you have. So I don't know, get a good reason. It's probably a good place to leave this here. So I have a couple videos coming up. I have the tracking sheet, which will probably be released on like the weekend of the 16th, 17th, and 18th, around there. And this is really going to be the best tracking sheet that's probably ever been released for language learning. It's the culmination of all of my experience studying 2,700 hours over like a year and a half of learning Chinese. Like I know what I'm talking about at this point. I have put in the time. I've talked to literally hundreds of people across the Discord about their experiences. We've consulted people on this sheet for what works. And this sheet is really a collaboration between me and my accountability partner, T, in trying to release something to the Refold community that's going to allow people to put up those walls in a healthy way, of course, to really move towards the goals that they have for learning a language. And then there's the accent and output video, which will probably come in like 2 or 3 weeks. But for now, thank you for listening. Thank you for all the growth on the channel. I hope you watched this with 2 times speed, because I realized I forgot to remind you guys. But yeah, I hope to see you in my upcoming videos. Feel free to subscribe when that sheet actually does come out, because I'm not going to be able to post it on like the typical channels that I have on Refold. So feel free to subscribe if that's something you're interested in. But other than that, take care and yeah, go immerse.